Margot. Over the years, I have made literally thousands of hospital visits, and most of those are pretty routine. I get there, I pay the visit, have some conversation, check see how the person's doing, pray, and I leave. And most of those are pretty non-memorable visits, at least for me. I'm sure they're always very memorable for those that go see. Anyway, of all the visits that I have made, though, there are a few that stand out, and one was made for me early on in ministry. I was pastoring in Charlotte, and I'd gotten word that this particular lady was in the hospital, and I went to pay the visit. And I hadn't been at the church that long, but I already knew this lady was crazy, because crazy's kind of like cream. It rises to the top, right? And so anyway, I just kind of knew that was true of her. And it was always, not meaning something bad, but just something always just kind of a little unusual with her. Anyway, I don't remember what the instance was or what the problem was that sent her to the hospital. I just remember that it wasn't something particularly concerning. And so whatever it was something she went to the hospital for, got some medicine, they sent her back home, and so she got better. But when I get to the hospital, I go in and I open the door and call her by name, and initially she is like, and this little sheepish voice, and then once I kind of get in there, we kind of go from talking about like this to talking about like this. And so we go to normal voice at this point, and we're talking for a number of minutes until the phone rings. And when the phone rings, she says, "Wait just a minute. Hello?" I'm like, "What?" And the entire conversation that she's having with whoever it is on the phone is like, yeah, not too good. Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah, I think for lunch they're bringing hamburgers today. I believe that's what. But honestly, it was about like that. As soon as she gets off the phone talking to me, we're back to normal voice again. And I wanted to laugh, but I didn't, at least then. But I was thinking as I'm watching this, this is ridiculous. This is just what? This is a game. It's a game. So like she's putting on and she's acting, but it depends on who she's engaging with that determines how it is that she operates. Regularly we see various shades of that type of behavior in our life and in our experience. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's alleged of us, and it shouldn't be, but we have regularly seen where an individual acts a particular way around a particular group of people or in a particular circumstance, but then if you change that, all of a sudden things are completely different. And when we see that, when we observe that, we start to use phrases like hypocrisy. We use words like actor. We use words like pretend. We use words like game. We don't like that. When we observe that, when we witness that, we are in many ways repelled by that, because instinctively, whether it is that somebody has a relationship with the Lord or not, people everywhere appreciate this. They appreciate authenticity. They appreciate consistency. They value that. They recognize that. And it matters that you are this way with one person and you are that way, the same way with another person, that you are this way in one circumstance and you're exactly the same way in another circumstance. That matters. That really connects with people. That really says something and communicates something truly of value about us. With that in mind, we're still working our way through a season of time in the life of Daniel in a series that we're calling Life in Babylon. And in short, this series is about a guy that has a relationship with God that's operating in a culture that doesn't. This is a man that takes his relationship with the Lord very seriously, and he's operating where there's a lot of pushback in the culture that he's operating in. And even though there's a lot of calendar dates that have passed since Daniel walked among us, those circumstances, hopefully you can say they're very familiar today. That as a follower of God, you're operating in a culture and a society and a world that's headed in the opposite direction from what you're called to operate in the direction you're called to go. Now, with that in mind, it is unfortunate that sometimes what it is that people witness among professing believers is this: who and what they are on a Sunday morning looks very different than who and what they are on a Friday night, on a Tuesday morning, on a Thursday afternoon. But the reality is that as a follower of God, as someone that takes my relationship with the Lord seriously, it should be that I am consistent. I am consistent. Even though the people around me may change, and even though the circumstances may change, there should be some things about me and about my walk with God that are consistent, that simply do not change. That's the question we want to think about today, and very simply it's this: what should remain consistent about my walk with God? And so even though the calendar changes and the seasons change and friends may change and work environments change and school years change and all of these things change, and we are experiencing all of these changes continuously, there are some things that shouldn't, as one that takes seriously your relationship with God. So what shouldn't change? Look with me in your Bibles today to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to start reading with verse 1. There we read that Darius is the new king at this point. He decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps therefore kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy. No negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that, as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the written edict. Likely, even if you haven't read this passage in a while or maybe ever, you maybe have been around your Bible or a Bible long enough to know this might be the setup for Daniel and the lion's den, and that is the case. But we start in verse 1 in a passage that helps answer that question for us. What is it that should remain consistent about my walk? What should remain consistent about your walk with God, regardless of the people around which you find yourself, regardless of the circumstances in which you're operating? Based on what we see here in Daniel's life, the first thing is this: my walk with God should produce uninterrupted integrity. Something that shouldn't change about my walk with God is that it should be producing, regardless of circumstances, uninterrupted integrity. Now, at this point in Daniel's life, in fact, when we first started the book of Daniel, we believe that he's somewhere around 15 years old when he's carted off with so many other Hebrews from Jerusalem to Babylon. And you remember at that point, the Babylonian king was a guy named Nebuchadnezzar, and long story short, Daniel, through a whole series of events, winds up becoming one of the chief advisors to the king. At this point, what has happened is that Nebuchadnezzar is gone, his successor is gone, and the successor is gone because he has been toppled. The Babylonian Empire has been toppled by a combination of the Medes and Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. They defeat the Babylonians, and a guy named Darius is now the head honcho. Darius is the king. And Daniel was probably around 15 when all of this started. At this point, they believe that he's somewhere around 80 to 82 years old. So he's not a young man. And maybe, I don't know about you, but growing up as a kid in Sunday school class, you would see Daniel tossed in the lion's den. You always pictured him as like a young person, but he's not. This is an older man at this point. 82 years old, and he is experiencing another transition. Things have changed, and now Darius is the king. And so he's operating in this Medo-Persian Empire that is now bigger. So it was the Babylonian Empire plus the Medo-Persian Empire, so it's even bigger. And if you are ruling a territory that's that massive, if you're in charge of a group of people that's that large, one of the things that you realize you need to do is that you need to ensure that you have control of all of this space, of all of these people. And you realize this is not something you can do by yourself. And so you need individuals that you can trust to appoint into various positions. And so what we see in this passage is that Darius appoints 120 satraps over the kingdom stationed throughout the realm. And so he divides it into provinces or states or districts. And so there's 120 satraps, which means a guardian of the kingdom. And so these are people that Darius trusts, that he realizes that he can depend on, that are not going to be trying to undermine him or overthrow his leadership. And so there's 120 of them throughout the empire. But think about this point in history. It's difficult to get people together. It's difficult to get people together in 2022, much less at 539 BC. And so if you are going to maintain control, you can't get all of those people together. You need to kind of divide those even into groups. And so that's what you see over them. He created 3 advisors, including Daniel. So you take those 120, and it looks like he's divided those into 3 groups, probably even groups. Maybe there's 40 per group. And so each of these administrators has 40-ish satraps that they're keeping check on, that they're helping to hold to account, that they're passing directions on and edicts and plans and purposes and questions, all of that stuff from the king. And Daniel is a guy at 80, 82 years old that gets one of these jobs. Well, why does he get a job like this? Well, because he has demonstrated himself to be someone that is dependable. He has demonstrated, not just for a period of time, but consistently over time, that this is somebody that when he says he is going to do something, he actually does it. This is someone who it seems that it has become evident. This is a guy, when he says something, it's accurate. He's telling you the truth. This is someone that if you ask them to do something and he says yes, you know that he is going to follow through. He is absolutely dependable. He is absolutely trustworthy. He is a guy that is shot through with integrity. And because of that, he is elevated to this position within what is now another enemy empire. I mean, ultimately, his allegiance would not be to the Babylonians or to the Medes or the Persians or the Medo-Persians. So how in the world did he wind up in that type of circumstance, elevated to this point? It's because Daniel is a guy that had a relationship with God that he took so seriously that even among those that did not know and walk with God, it became evident that this is a guy who is dependable. This is a guy who is trustworthy. This is a guy that absolutely possesses real and unimpeachable integrity. That should be true whether it's 539 BC or 2022 AD. Among those that have a relationship with God, we ought to be those that regardless of the circumstance, regardless of who's watching, regardless of what environment we are in, that we are those that are just simply shot through with integrity. In the workplace, you ought to be someone that is known by those that are over you and even among those that you work among, that you are dependable, that you don't show up late, that you're not stealing office supplies, that when you say you're going to do something, you do it. And if you fail to do something as you should, that you own that and you don't try to shirk responsibility. That as a student, that you're one that is, when a teacher asks you something, that you give an honest answer and that you're truthful in answers that you give on a test, and you're not trying to take that which belongs to someone else or take credit that belongs to someone else, that you're plagiarizing documents and all this kind of stuff. That should not be true of those that have a relationship with God, because regardless of the environment we're in, whether it's a Sunday school class, a vacation Bible school class, or it's a biology class, or it is a biology lab that you're running as an adult, if you're someone that has a relationship with God, that relationship with Him, something that should not change, is that there should be uninterrupted integrity. Because if you have interrupted integrity, if you have sporadic integrity, do you really have it? Let me give you an example. It's been a number of years ago, we had gone as a family to the Asheville area, and we stayed at Ridgecrest for a couple of nights. And I remember when we got there, Caroline was asking the person that was checking us in. She said, "Hey, are there any restaurants that you would recommend in this area?" And he said, "Well, what kind of stuff do you like?" And she said something about barbecue. And he said, "Well, there's a couple of places." And he said, "This one particular place is really good." And so after hearing that, we looked up on our phones to find out where exactly this place was. We get there. And when we get there, it's a little early and maybe just barely 5 o'clock. And so when we get there, there is almost no one that is in the dining room at this point. But we sit down, and they give us menus, and I'm looking at the menu, and one of the things that I see on the menu is brisket. And I'd only had brisket one time before in Fort Worth, and I loved it. And I thought, that was crazy good. I wonder if this might be good as well. And so when the waitress comes over, I said, "Hey, is the brisket good?" And this is no joke. The waitress, standing there at the table, hollers back at the kitchen, "Hey, is the brisket good today?" Which I hope we can all agree is not a good sign. Excuse me. So she hollers back, "Hey, is the brisket good today?" It is not encouraging to have a question like that asked because, in truth, it should be this: the brisket is either good or it's not. You know, some things either are or they are not. Like, you can't be a little bit married, can you? Can you be a little bit pregnant? I mean, you either are or you are not. And with respect to integrity, you are either a man, a woman, a teenager. You're a person either of integrity or not. It should be, if you have a relationship with God and you take that seriously, one of the absolute byproducts that regardless of the circumstance, whether it's 10:30 on a Sunday morning seated here in the sanctuary at Gate City, or it's in your office, it's in your car, it's in the store, it's wherever it is that you find yourself, it should be that relationship with God produces consistent, uninterrupted integrity. But it should produce something else, and that's this. My walk with God should produce exasperation of my enemies. It should be the case that consistently, even though stuff is changing all around me, my walk with God ought to exasperate my enemies. What does that mean? Look what's going on in this passage. Daniel is doing an outstanding job. And even though he's in the winter years of his life, he is still dependable and trustworthy. He is still a reliable counselor. He is still someone that follows through in what he says. But you've got these other people that are around him. You have other satraps, and you have other administrators that they don't like the fact that, among other things, they're probably consistently being compared to Daniel. "Oh, Daniel did such a good job again. Let's have staff meeting. Oh, Daniel, tell us how wonderful you did again today." And it just seems like there's always this steady stream of applause for Daniel, and people around him begin to really resent that. And they realize that he has this position, and they don't want him to have it because they think, "I could have that." I mean, this is a guy that, not only did he come from the Babylonians, he wasn't even one of them. He's one of those Hebrews. So this is a gig, this is a position, this is a job that ought to belong to one of us. And so they begin to conspire to figure out somehow, some way that they can get rid of him, but they have a problem. Because of what? Verse 3 says that Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and the satraps. He had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. They're watching all of this, and they're resenting this. They're resenting Daniel, and now it looks like the joker's going to get a promotion. He's going to be made the number 2 guy. And so they start thinking, man, we can't have this. Verse 4, the administrators, satraps, therefore, they kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. So we've got to get some dirt on this guy. Well, we've got to come up with something so that we can say, man, look at this Daniel. Don't do this. Get him out of here. It's not simply that he shouldn't be promoted. We ought to just toss him. But what happens? It says they could find no charge or corruption because he was trustworthy. No negligence or corruption was found in him. They have nothing to be able to come up with. In fact, if it gets to a point where they're going to be able to say something negative against Daniel, they're going to have to somehow fabricate it. What am I saying? I'm saying that how Daniel operated as a follower of God was such that even among those that didn't like him, even among those that became his enemies, even those that were working against him, for them to say something negative, they'd have to make it up, because Daniel, as a follower of God, exasperated his enemies. It is the case that if you are taking your relationship with God seriously, you're going to ruffle some feathers. And you're going to take stands and positions at work, at school, in the neighborhood, in all kinds of different situations that other people may not like. They may not applaud, and they may resent you for it. But if they are going to say something ill against you, there ought to be no bullets in their gun. It ought to be that we are operating in such a way that if they say something ill against us, it ought to be that they very simply have to make it up. It's been quite some years now since I had what I would describe as a store-bought haircut, but I remember the last person that cut my hair. She was a real nice lady. It was back in Charlotte. Her name was Barb, and I had been going to her for a number of years, and my schedule, every 3 weeks I would go to get a haircut. And I went to see her one day, and on this particular day when I walked in, I hoped that my face did not betray what I was thinking inside, but I was like, holy cow, because her hair looked bad. And it was like black spiky, short black spiky in the back, and then like platinum blonde up here. It was, to me, I thought it was very skunk-like. And inside, I'm thinking, whoa. But I don't say anything. Anyway, so we just have normal conversation like I would normally have with Barb while she's cutting my hair. And she's almost done, and she says to me this: "You hadn't said anything about my new haircut." So I've got some choices. I can say, I thought maybe you were doing like a Pepe Le Pew impersonation. Do you like Cruella de Vil? Did you like that lady on, what was that angel show with Della Reese? Touched by an Angel. Did you like Della Reese's hair? But I can't say any of that. I just cannot muster the words to say that just looks wonderful. And so my answer was, yeah, I thought something looked different. Because the reality is this: if I was going to say something nice about this wreck on her head, I would have had to make it up. I would have had to make it up. Listen, if you take your relationship with the Lord seriously, you're going to find yourself, it's just going to happen, you're going to be ruffling some feathers because you're running against the drift of culture. You're operating with principles and standards that are contrary and counter to what the world is saying. You're operating with a foundation of truth that the world does not accept. And by nature, that is going to sometimes put you at odds with people, and they're not going to like you, and they're going to resent you. But if they are going to say something ill of you, it better be because they simply made it up, that you have exasperated your enemies. And if they raise their gun to fire it at you, there are nothing but blanks in there, because there is nothing legitimate that they're able to say against you. Why? Because your walk with God ought not just be what happens on Sunday, it should be consistent. And something that should not change, even though everything else around us does, is that your enemies should be exasperated. But finally, something that should be true of us is this: that my walk with God should be rooted in my identity. My walk with God should be rooted in my identity. What does that mean? It's interesting after these other leaders in the Medo-Persian Empire, they've gotten together, they've scratched their heads, they've gone through a whole list of things. Maybe, how about jaywalking? What about horn blowing? What about all kinds of, what can we come up with that this joker has done? And they can't find anything. And so finally, you see in verse 5, it says, "These men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel unless what? We find something against him concerning the law of his God." Why do they resort to that? Because a couple of things are known. First of all, it is known that Daniel is a guy that has a relationship with God. Is it because he put one of those fish things on his camel? He had a WWJD bracelet. Why is that? Well, it's because, not because he was trying to beat people over the head, but it's anybody that would encounter Daniel and have more than a passing conversation would come to know this is a guy that knows and walks with God. Understand that your relationship with God, it is absolutely the case that it is genuinely, sincerely, and deeply personal, but it is never, ever, ever a private affair. Your relationship with God is personal, but it is not private. And anybody that comes in contact with you for any real measure of time, it should become evident to them pretty quickly, whether they share your convictions or not. This is somebody that has a relationship with God. This is somebody that believes some stuff that this book communicates. Whether they do or not, they should realize that. These other satraps, these other administrators, these other prefects, they have discovered this to be true about Daniel. Why? Because he wasn't operating as an undercover follower of God. He was just operating as somebody that was taking this seriously. Whether people liked it or not, whether they applauded or not, he kept plugging away. And it was not simply that it was known that this is a guy who has a relationship with God. It was also known this is a guy that is serious about it. Now keep in mind, these are not people who share his convictions. These are not people who share his faith. These are not people that share the same walk with God as Daniel does. But they know this, Daniel has that and he's serious about it. Listen, it is not simply in the life of the church and sitting in Sunday school class where people are making evaluations about you and about the extent of your commitment to the Lord. We're all doing that. We are. We're evaluating ourselves. We're evaluating others. But people outside the walls of this building, people that do not have a walk with God, are evaluating whether or not what you say you're actually following through, whether you're serious about this or it's just something that you do on Sundays. It was known by people that did not know God, that Daniel did, and he was serious about it. And so they decided, you know what, if we're going to somehow entrap this guy, it's got to be something related to his commitment to God. Because we know he's so serious about that, if we can somehow put him at odds with the king, and God will have him. Because we know if the choice is between God and the king, he's going to choose God. Because following God is not simply what Daniel does, it's who he is. Most of the time, if I have a conversation with somebody that I'm meeting for the first time, generally speaking, I don't let them know that, at least out of the gate, that I'm a pastor. It's not because it's something I'm ashamed of or anything. For one thing, people act different when they find that out about you, and so I want them to deal with me as they would anybody else. But there are some instances where I do say that I'm a pastor. And like, for example, this past week, I repeatedly had to go to the hospital. And if you've been to any Cone location at this point, you're aware in this post-COVID environment that you're limited to 2 visitors per day. And it's the same, if you have 2 visitors, it has to be just those 2 that can see you. But the good thing is ministers don't count. And so anyway, I'm going to the hospital this past week to pay a visit. I go up to the desk and I say, I'm here, for example, I'm here to see Boyd Russell. I'm his pastor. I don't give him my name. I say I'm a pastor. In that instance, I'm telling them what I do. I'm not telling them who I am. I'm telling them what I do. In that circumstance, it makes sense. I don't want to rob somebody else of the opportunity to visit. But very easily what can happen is that we relegate our relationship with God to what we do. I'm a Christian, so that means that I'm one of those church-going people. It should be the case that your walk with God is so real, it's not merely what you do, it's who you are. Why does that matter? Because if there is something that you do, at some point you stop it, don't you? I mean, sincerely, I love what I do. I love what God has called me to. But at some point, I'll probably be too old to do this. At some point, I'd like to retire. Maybe next month. Whatever it is that your task is, your job is, that's what you do. Never, ever confuse that with who you are. And if you are one that has a relationship with God, being a child of God, that should be not what you do, it's who you are. And when it is who you are, do you know what that means? Even if everything around you changes, you don't. You're still operating as a follower of God, not because that's what you do, but because of who you are. How are they going to be able to entrap and ensnare Daniel? Not because they were trying to trap him on what he does. They're trying to trap him up because they know his walk with God is so consistent. He's not going to choose the king over God, because being a follower of God, that's who he is. His commitment to God was consistent, and it was rooted in his identity and who he was. Listen, a lot of time has transpired since these words were penned and these circumstances occurred, but the same types of things are occurring today. And you're getting pressure and pushback from all sorts of different environments, especially our teenagers today. I mean, you think of all things that our kids are being exposed to through media, through entertainment, through schools, through peers, through all sorts of environments. In particular, you're getting pressure to head in the opposite direction. And very easily what you can do is to try to operate like a chameleon and just blend in at work, blend in at school, and just kind of hang with the crowd. But it should be the case that even if everything else changes, there's some stuff that simply doesn't. Why? Because of your commitment to God. And it's rooted in not what you do, it's rooted in who you are. Will you bow your heads with me?